Turn the page, strike the match, breathe. At 70, silence isn't an absence of sound, it's a living substance. In my workshop, tucked within the quiet folds of the Hudson Valley, the only voice that matters belongs to the past. Under the cold glare of my desk lamp, I held a surgical scalpel in my right hand and a magnifier clamped to my brow. Beneath my blade lay an 18th century oil painting, a canvas choked by 2 centuries of oxidized varnish, soot, and careless overpainting. People ask why I spent 40 years restoring damaged art. They think it's about making old things look new. It isn't. Restoration is subtraction. You peel away the yellowed resins and superficial gloss to find what was truly built beneath. You strip away the lies to reveal the original structure. If your hand shakes by even a fraction of a millimeter, you gouge the canvas and destroy history. You have to wait, watch, and let the solvents do their work. On my 70th birthday, the silence of my studio was broken not by the clock, but by the heavy crunch of gravel in the driveway. A late-model luxury SUV skidded to a halt. The door slammed, footsteps rushed across the veranda. Julian, my 42-year-old son-in-law, pushed open the oak door without knocking, holding a small bakery box tied with a satin ribbon. Behind him stood my daughter, Claire, her eyes darting nervously. Claire looked exhausted, her natural warmth eaten away by years in Julian's shadow. But Julian looked electric. He always looked electric when he was hunting. "Happy 70th, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice carrying that practiced theatrical warmth of a salesman. He didn't kiss my cheek. Instead, his eyes immediately swept the perimeter of the room. They swept across the hand-adzed white oak floorboards I had laid down myself. They measured the 12-foot ceilings, the massive fieldstone hearth, and the towering north-facing windows that flooded the 4,000-square-foot structure with natural daylight. This wasn't a birthday visit. It was an inventory. "You shouldn't be bent over these tiny canvases at your age, Eleanor. My God, look at this place. Do you know what a commercial appraisal on an estate of this scale in the Hudson Valley commands right now? We checked Zillow this morning. $4.8 million minimum, and it's just sitting here, empty. A 70-year-old woman rattling around in a multi-million-dollar compound." I didn't flinch. I kept the flat of my blade resting against the aged canvas, my breathing steady. I had spent decades scraping away deceit. I could smell the rotten varnish of Julian's intentions. Claire finally stepped forward, setting a paper coffee cup on the table. Her voice was thin, echoing the talking points Julian had fed her during the drive. "Mom, Julian is right. We're just worried about you. The upkeep on a massive property like this, the taxes, the maintenance, the insurance, it's bleeding your retirement dry. It's too much weight for someone your age to carry alone." "It's not just financial, Claire," Julian chimed in, closing the physical distance to crowd my workspace. He leaned his palms down on my workbench, ignoring the streaks of linseed oil on his cuffs. He looked right down at me with a cold smirk. "Let's be completely honest, Eleanor. At 70, cognitive slips happen, memory fades. Managing a property asset worth $4.8 million requires active legal oversight. If something happened to you tomorrow, a fall, a medical emergency, do you know how much probate court and inheritance taxes would chew out before Claire ever saw a single dime?" There it was, the core of the rot. The word dime dropped onto the floor like a lead weight. He straightened his jacket, adjusting his lapels. He offered a tight smile, leaning in as if we were business partners. "We talked to a legal consultant. We want to set up a family asset management trust, just a simple administrative framework. We place the deed into a shared management pool, appoint me as the managing trustee to handle all operational costs and logistics. That way, you don't have to worry about a single bill. You can just sit back, relax, and enjoy your golden years while we secure the asset for the family." "Secure the asset," I repeated quietly. The words tasted like copper. Julian nodded eagerly, missing the glacial chill in my tone entirely. "Exactly. It protects the legacy. It's smart, clean, and practical." I placed my scalpel down on the mahogany block. The tiny metal click sounded remarkably loud. I looked up, meeting Julian's gaze directly, not with the trembling confusion of a frightened old woman, but with the flat, clinical detachment of a restorer who had just found a deep structural fracture. I knew exactly what that trust meant. It wasn't about protecting my health or managing my bills. It was the first stroke of a solvent designed to strip away my name from the deed, dissolve my independence, and leave me a tenant in my own home. And as I looked at my daughter standing silently behind him, too blind to speak up for her own mother, I realized something chilling. The most dangerous cracks in a structure aren't the ones outside. They are the ones hidden deep inside, rotting away quietly in the dark, waiting for someone to lean too hard against them. Julian wanted to paint over my life with his name. He just didn't realize that when you start scraping away at an old master's canvas, you don't always find what you expect. Sometimes you find a trap waiting beneath. 3 days after my 70th birthday, the silence of my workshop was punctured by the ping of my phone. It was a text from Julian, checking in with a sickeningly sweet display of false piety, asking if I had slept on his trust proposal. I didn't reply. I loaded my old Ford pickup with empty chemical carboys, needing to drive down to the solvent depot across the ridge before the rain set in. The truck is an old 1998 Ford F-150 with a manual transmission. I've driven these mountain roads for 30 years. I know every curve of the winding Hudson Valley descent, where the asphalt dips after a frost, and exactly how much pressure to feed into the brake pedal before the hairpin turn near the old mill. The descent starts with a steep drop flanked by dense oak forest on one side and a sheer drop-off into a dry creek bed on the other. Halfway down that slope, as I lifted my foot from the accelerator and shifted down into second gear, I pressed my foot hard onto the brake pedal to scrub off speed for the curve. Nothing happened. The pedal plunged straight down to the floor mat with zero resistance. Panic is a luxury for people who have time to waste. My instincts, honed by decades of keeping my hands steady over delicate canvases, took over instantly. I yanked hard on the mechanical emergency handbrake, pumped the dead pedal twice, and downshifted aggressively, letting the engine roar as it ground against the transmission. The truck fishtailed twice on the loose gravel before screaming to a halt barely 3 inches away from a thick granite milestone. I sat there in the sudden stillness, listening to the ticking of the cooling exhaust pipe. I didn't call AAA. I backed carefully out of the shoulder and drove the remaining 3 miles straight to Bob's garage. Bob has known me for decades. His hands are stained with motor oil, and his eyes miss nothing. Bob hoisted the Ford up on the hydraulic lift, wiped his hands on a rag, and climbed underneath with a flashlight. 10 minutes later, he called me over, his jaw tight as he pointed up at the front wheel assembly. "Eleanor, look right here," Bob said, shining his light directly onto the master brake cylinder line. This flare nut holding the primary hydraulic hose didn't vibrate loose. Road vibration doesn't back a brass fitting out 2.5 full turns with surgical precision. Somebody put an open-end wrench on this, gave it a clean, deliberate twist, and backed it off just enough so it would hold for a mile of low-speed driving, and then fail completely the moment you hit high pressure on a steep grade. This wasn't bad maintenance, Eleanor. Somebody tried to put you in the ditch. I looked at the loose fitting, feeling the cold air settle deep into my bones. Julian had stood in my workshop 3 days ago, eyeing my property. He wanted the $4.8 million estate, and he realized that waiting was taking too long. I thanked Bob, swore him to absolute secrecy, and drove home at 20 miles per hour with my hazard lights blinking. I didn't rush to the local police station to file a frantic report. I went straight to my study, opened my laptop, and dialed Marcus Brody. Marcus is a senior partner at a boutique trust and estate firm down in Manhattan. He handled my husband's holdings years ago. He's a man who treats confidentiality like a religion. "Eleanor,"
Marcus's calm voice came through the receiver. "I hope you're not calling to tell me you're rewriting your legacy for that real estate agent." "Not quite, Marcus," I said. "I need you to run a full background and financial profile on Julian Vance. Everything. Credit bureaus, civil liens, commercial debts, and private merchant cash advances tied to failed land speculations. Two of those private lenders are already threatening legal action and asset seizure within 60 days. $340,000, a credit score of 410, a man desperate enough to loosen the brake lines on an old woman's truck just to fast-track an inheritance." Marcus leaned forward. He's backed into a corner. People with numbers like that do dangerous things when they see a $4.8 million asset within reach. What are your next steps? I looked down at the financial report, then turned my gaze toward the window, watching the rain trace long, crooked paths down the glass. Julian thought he was the hunter, laying traps behind my back. He didn't understand the first rule of restoration. When you find a hidden structural crack, you don't panic. You map the fracture, study its depth, and wait for the precise moment to let the weight of the structure do the work for you. Julian had brought this game to my doorstep. Now, it was time to see who was actually in control.
4 days after Marcus handed me Julian's financial obituary, my property was invaded under the polite guise of a Sunday afternoon garden gathering. Julian didn't ask for permission. He simply informed me via group text that he had invited 12 potential real estate clients, local business associates, and acquaintances up to the estate to view the historic architecture and enjoy a catered buffet on the terrace. When their cars rolled up the gravel drive, I watched from my studio window as Julian played the role of the proud, burdened caretaker. He moved among the guests with a glass of sparkling water in hand, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the lawn. He wasn't talking about architectural history or art restoration. He was planting seeds. I caught fragments drifting through the open window, phrases about the heavy burden of looking after aging parents, concerning memory lapses and early-stage cognitive decline that makes independent living unsafe. It was a calculated performance designed to weaponize public perception, framing me as a frail, confused old woman who needed protection from herself. By late afternoon, after the guests had filtered away from the terrace and into the main parlor, Julian struck. He strode into my workshop carrying a sleek leather portfolio, his face radiating that dangerous, predatory confidence of a man who thought he had already won. Claire walked a few paces behind him, her gaze fixed rigidly on the floorboards, her shoulders tense with a heavy, miserable resignation. Julian didn't bother with pleasantries. He flipped open the leather portfolio, pulled out a thick stack of legal-looking documents bound with blue backing paper, and dropped them onto my work table, right over an unfinished canvas. "Let's not drag this out, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice dropping into that smooth, condescending register he used when he thought nobody else was listening. "We've got the preliminary administrative paperwork right here for the Family Asset Management Trust we discussed. Everyone at the local Chamber of Commerce knows you're struggling to manage a $4.8 million property on your own. Just sign on the dotted line right now in front of your own daughter and let us handle the burden so you can finally rest." Claire stopped forward, her voice trembling, echoing the script she had been fed for months. "Mom, please, why do you always have to make everything so difficult and stubborn? Just sign it. You're being selfish, and you're breaking my heart by fighting us on this." Stubborn, selfish, two words designed to trigger guilt in any mother. But my hands didn't shake. I remembered the advice Marcus Brody had drilled into me during our phone call the previous evening after I briefed him on Julian's public rumors. "Never slam a door in a predator's face, Eleanor," Marcus had advised. "Let them walk right through it, but make sure the room they enter has no exit." I didn't yell and I didn't refuse him outright.
To refuse would allow Julian to cry foul and run to a judge, claiming an obstinate, paranoid senior was blocking family welfare. Instead, I reached slowly into my drawer, pulled out my own sleek Mont Blanc fountain pen, and turned the document toward me. If this is truly about administrative convenience and protecting the family, Julian, I suppose there is no reason to delay, I said quietly, my voice entirely level. Julian's eyes lit up with a greedy, triumphant flash. He handed me the pen. I flipped directly to the signature page, where a pre-printed block designated the execution of a standard durable power of attorney. But before my pen touched the paper, I added a handwritten amendment right beneath the signature line, referencing Schedule A4 of New York statutory law, exactly as Marcus had structured it. I handed the portfolio back to him without looking up. Julian grabbed the papers, scanned the signature block with a broad, arrogant grin, and chuckled. "See? Was that really so hard? Welcome to the 21st century, Eleanor." He and Claire packed up their things and left within 10 minutes, eager to rush down to their financial backers with the signed instrument in hand. They drove away believing they had just legally annexed a $4.8 million estate. What Julian was too arrogant and too legally illiterate to notice was the exact wording of the statutory amendment I had woven into that signature block. It wasn't a standard immediate power of attorney, it was a springing durable power of attorney, and under its binding legal clauses, the document possessed a silent, absolute trigger condition. It was legally dormant and completely inert. It could never be activated, nor could a single asset be touched, unless it was accompanied by independent, unanimous medical certification from 2 court-appointed psychiatric specialists explicitly confirming total cognitive incompetence. Julian thought he had captured the fortress. He didn't realize he had just signed a contract that required a strict judicial medical panel to unlock a door that would never open. The trap was set, and the bait looked sweeter than anything he had ever stolen.
Greed is a terrible architect. It builds high, it builds fast, and it always forgets to check the foundation. Julian had the signed power of attorney document in his briefcase, but a springing power of attorney is a dead letter on a shelf until its strict conditions are met. It requires formal medical activation. Under normal circumstances, that would mean months of court filings, independent psychiatric panels, and medical board reviews. But Julian didn't have months. His creditors were breathing down his neck. His personal credit score was sitting at 410, and his $340,000 in commercial debt was coming due. He was desperate, and desperation hates patience. Instead of waiting for proper legal channels, Julian decided to buy a shortcut. 2 days after leaving my estate, through a shady network of real estate brokers and private contacts down in the city, Julian found a disgraced, cash-strapped medical practitioner, a former psychiatrist whose license had been restricted years prior for prescription violations. For a cash bribe of $12,000, pocketed cleanly under the table, this doctor signed a fraudulent medical affidavit. The document, falsely certifying that I, Eleanor Vance, suffered from severe, irreversible cognitive decay and complete mental incompetence, rendering me entirely incapable of managing my own legal or financial affairs. It was a complete fabrication, signed by a man who had never even laid eyes on me, let alone conducted a clinical evaluation. Armed with that fake medical certification and the springing triggered power of attorney document I had signed with my Mont Blanc pen, Julian thought he held the master key to a $4.8 million empire. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Julian walked through the polished glass doors of a major commercial bank in Midtown Manhattan. He strode straight up to the commercial lending division, carrying a leather folio bulging with the paperwork.
He requested an emergency appointment with a senior loan officer to freeze my personal checking accounts, take over the primary title deed of my Hudson Valley estate, and execute an immediate commercial equity line of credit of $1.5 million in cash against the unencumbered property. What Julian didn't know, because predators are always too blind to look beyond their own reflection, was that Marcus Brody had anticipated every single step of his descent. Weeks prior, Marcus had quietly established a direct administrative alert protocol with the executive branch of that very same banking institution. The bank's regional vice president was a former law school classmate of Marcus Brody and a personal friend of my late husband. When Julian's application hit the desk, accompanied by the suspicious medical affidavit and the conditional power of attorney document I had signed with my Mont Blanc pen, the bank's internal fraud prevention unit didn't reject him at the counter. Instead, following Marcus's precise instructions, they smiled, played along, and escorted him into a private glass-walled executive conference room to process the paperwork. Julian sat at the mahogany conference table, his face flushed with triumphs, eagerly sliding the bribe-backed medical affidavit across the desk alongside my signed document. The owner is elderly, completely incapacitated, and unable to manage her affairs, Julian said, his voice dripping with smooth, arrogant confidence as he leaned back in his leather chair. We need this credit line unlocked and wired immediately. No delays. The loan officer nodded politely, excused himself for a moment under the pretense of fetching the final authorization stamps, and left the room. Julian didn't know that every inch of that conference room was wired with high-definition digital cameras and crystal-clear directional audio. He didn't know that the bank's compliance division was recording every single word, every hand gesture, and every fraudulent signature he presented. By formally submitting a fabricated medical certification to a federally insured financial institution for the purpose of seizing and encumbering real estate that did not belong to him, Julian had crossed a very dangerous line. Under federal United States law, what Julian just did wasn't a minor civil dispute or a family disagreement. It crossed straight into federal territory. It constituted mortgage fraud and bank wire fraud, a severe federal felony carrying mandatory prison time under Title 18 of the United States Code. As Julian sat there waiting for millions of dollars to drop into his accounts, federal investigators and bank security compliance officers were already reviewing the digital files being streamed in real time to Marcus Brody's office down the street. Julian thought he was pulling off the heist of a lifetime. In reality, with every stroke of his pen and every word of his testimony recorded on camera, he was carefully tying a federal noose around his own neck. Greed had handed him the shovel, and in his rush to bury me, he had dug his own grave.
A predator who thinks he has already won becomes careless. 2 weeks after Julian's little trip to the Midtown Manhattan bank, unaware that every second of his transaction was being recorded and streamed straight to federal investigators, he received an automated notification from my attorney. It wasn't a subpoena or a police warning. It was a formal invitation, penned in my own handwriting, inviting both him and my daughter Claire up to the Hudson Valley estate for a Sunday afternoon tea. The message was simple: a final family sit-down to review the transition of the property and finalize the handover before I packed my belongings. Julian took it as the ultimate surrender. To him, the invitation meant that the bank wire was clearing, the fake medical affidavit had done its job, and the old woman had finally accepted her defeat. When their luxurious SUV crunched up the gravel driveway that Sunday afternoon, they didn't look like guests visiting a home. They looked like landlords inspecting a newly acquired asset. Claire carried a white bakery box tied with a thick red ribbon, stepping out onto the stone veranda with a look of heavy, forced compliance. "I brought your favorite apple cinnamon pie, Mom," Claire said quietly, her voice thin as she placed the box down on the mahogany dining table inside my studio. It was a strange, grim little tradition.
Every time Julian wanted to carve up something that belonged to me, Claire would show up with a sweet pastry, as if a slice of warm baked apples could sweeten the bitter taste of betrayal. The internet calls it the classic prelude, the last supper before the executioner drops the axe. I didn't smile and I didn't touch the box. I simply reached for the cake server, sliced a clean wedge of the pie, and placed it neatly on a small china plate, setting it down at Julian's place at the head of the table. I didn't take a piece for myself. I just sat back in my wooden armchair, watching them. Julian didn't notice the chill in the room. He was already leaning back in his chair, wearing the grin of a man who thought he owned the world. He reached across the table, tapped his fingers against the polished wood, and let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. "Let's stop pretending we need a long goodbye, Eleanor. The bank paperwork is moving forward, and from this afternoon onward, this entire $4.8 million estate is officially under my operational control. I'll give you a week, 7 days flat, to pack up your paints, clear out your tools from the workshop, and find yourself a quiet little senior apartment in town." 7 days. He was evicting a 70-year-old woman from the very home she had built and lived in for decades, talking to me like a corporate liquidator clearing out a bankrupt warehouse. Claire lowered her eyes, staring down at her coffee cup, unable to meet my gaze. Her silence was louder than any argument she could have made. I didn't raise my voice, slam my fist, or shed a single tear. In art restoration, you never scream at a damaged canvas when you find a structural fault. You simply let the solvent do its quiet work. With a slow, deliberate movement, I reached over to my desk, picked up a thick, weathered blue manila folder tied with a cotton string, and slid it smoothly across the mahogany tabletop right between Julian's untouched plate of pie and his coffee mug. Julian glanced down at the blue folder, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. "What is this?" he asked, his voice losing his booming confidence. "Open it, Julian," I said, my tone as cold and steady as winter stone. "Consider it your final inheritance walkthrough." Julian frowned, reached out, untied the string, and flipped open the cover. Inside lay a certified, stamped legal instrument dating back 15 years, a comprehensive multi-page document bearing the seal of the New York State Supreme Court and the official registry stamp of the county clerk. As his eyes scanned the first few paragraphs, the arrogant color slowly drained from his face. His fingers began to tremble slightly against the paper. The smooth smirk vanished completely, replaced by a sudden look of absolute terror. It wasn't a standard deed. It was the master foundational charter of an irrevocable historical heritage trust, a legal entity established 15 years prior, right after my husband passed away, placing the entirety of the Hudson Valley land, the main house, and the antique restoration workshop under the permanent protection of a federal and state-backed cultural preservation covenant. He stared at the pages, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes locked onto the immutable ownership clause. The property didn't belong to me to give away, nor could it ever be sold, mortgaged, seized, or transferred by any family member, spouse, or third-party claimant. It belonged to the trust, forever. He looked up from the papers, his face turning the color of chalk, looking at me not with the condescension of a predator, but with the cold, crushing realization of a rat staring straight into the jaws of a trap. The game wasn't ending the way he planned. The executioner wasn't me. It was the law he thought he could outsmart.
The illusion of control is a fragile thing. It shatters the exact moment a predator realizes the cage door was locked from the outside. Less than 48 hours after walking out of my studio with his arrogant smirk and his 7-day eviction notice, Julian discovered the true cost of his unchecked ambition. It started on a crisp Thursday morning with a frantic, high-stakes phone call to the Midtown Manhattan Commercial Bank. Julian had spent the entire week celebrating, dividing up imaginary cash in his head, and planning how he would allocate the $1.5 million from the equity line of credit to wipe out his mounting obligations.
He dialed the senior loan officer's direct extension, expecting the routine confirmation of a wire transfer. Instead, he was greeted by a stony silence, followed by the dry, formal voice of the bank's chief compliance officer. The transaction wasn't processing, the funds weren't releasing, the account was locked under an immediate high-priority fraud freeze. Mr. Sterling, our internal audit division and federal banking compliance investigators have completed your rigorous review of your submitted documents, the compliance officer stated, his voice devoid of any warmth. The medical affidavit you provided has been flagged as a fraudulent instrument, and the property title you attempted to encumber is legally untouchable. As an independent entity registered under a federal historical preservation covenant, the estate cannot be mortgaged, pledged, or seized by any individual. Your application has been rejected, and all digital records of this transaction have been handed over to federal authorities. Julian slammed the phone down onto his mahogany desk, refusing to believe it. He thought it was a bureaucratic glitch, a temporary hurdle that could be bribed or bullied away. He rushed to his laptop, pulling up his corporate ledger, his credit reports, and his commercial debt accounts, sweating profusely as his phone buzzed continuously with overdue notices from his real estate creditors. His $340,000 in short-term commercial debt was now in default, and his personal credit score had completely collapsed into the low 400s. Desperate for a legal loophole, Julian called his personal attorney to review the blue folder I had handed him at the table. It took his lawyer less than 20 minutes to call him back, sounding utterly terrified. "Julian, what on earth did you sign?" his attorney demanded over the line, his voice shaking with disbelief. "This isn't just a standard trust. It's an irrevocable historical heritage trust tied directly to New York State commercial preservation statutes established under the landmark 2012 Act. Under Section 12 of that charter, any unauthorized third party who attempts to file fraudulent ownership claims, forge management rights, or encumber trust-protected assets triggers an automatic, non-negotiable administrative commercial penalty." Julian's breath hitched in his throat. What penalty? $1,200,000, the lawyer replied grimly. And, under federal and state bankruptcy exemptions, commercial penalties tied to intentional real estate fraud cannot be discharged, wiped out, or restructured through personal bankruptcy. It follows you for the rest of your natural life. A $1,200,000 administrative fine, added to his existing $340,000 in commercial debt, Julian was staring down a financial abyss of over $1.5 million in personal liabilities, with zero assets, zero income, and zero way out of the trap. The silence in his office must have been deafening. He had started this entire scheme to dig himself out of a minor financial hole, and in his greedy haste, he engineered his own total economic destruction. And the financial penalty was half the nightmare. While Julian sat at his desk staring at the numbers in sheer disbelief, the Federal Banking Fraud Division was already finalizing the paperwork for his formal arrest. By attempting to execute a fraudulent commercial loan using a forged medical affidavit and a falsified power of attorney, Julian had committed multiple counts of federal bank wire fraud and mortgage fraud under Title 18 of the United States Code. When the federal agents finally knocked on his door later that week, there was no dramatic confrontation, no grand escape, and no negotiation, just the cold click of steel handcuffs wrapping around the wrists of a man who thought he could outsmart the law. Greed promised him a $4.8 million empire, but the law delivered what it always reserves for predators: a prison cell, a crippling lifetime debt, and the absolute certainty that justice collects what it is owed. Greed is a very loyal companion until the prison doors open, and then it abandons you in a heartbeat.
Less than 24 hours after Julian received the crushing confirmation of his financial ruin and his $1 million administrative penalties, the final hammer of federal justice swung down with absolute, unstoppable force. It was a gray, overcast Thursday morning when unmarked black SUVs rolled quietly down the suburban street outside Julian and Claire's home. There were no flashing sirens, no dramatic warnings, and no negotiations. Federal Bureau of Investigation's special agents and state financial fraud inspectors stepped out onto the manicured lawn, moving with the cold, deliberate precision of a machine. They walked straight up to the front door, bypassed the doorbell, and served the formal federal arrest warrants. Within minutes, the front door swung open, and Julian was led out onto the porch in heavy handcuffs. The man who had strutted through my studio with an arrogant smirk, demanding a 70-year-old woman clear out her life within 7 days, now looked pale, sweating, and utterly hollowed out by reality. The moment the steel cuffs clicked around his wrists, the polished mask of confidence vanished completely, exposing the cowardly, selfish core underneath. Facing mandatory federal prison time under Title 18 for bank fraud, mortgage forgery, and medical bribery, Julian didn't even try to stand like a man. He panicked, twisted around, and immediately turned on the person who had defended him, protected him, and obeyed his every command for years. "You can't arrest just me," Julian screamed, his voice cracking with sheer desperation as he pointed frantically back toward the doorway at his wife. "She's just as guilty. Claire was the one who pushed me into this. She provided the family background, she leaked her mother's private schedules, and she was an active accomplice who agreed to sign every document to pressure her own mother into handing over the property." Claire stood frozen on the threshold of the porch, staring at her husband in absolute paralyzed horror. Her color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost in broad daylight. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth as the words hung heavy and brutal in the cold morning air. He didn't hesitate for a single second to sell her down the river. The man she had chosen over her own mother, the husband she had defended as misunderstood while he plotted behind her back, threw her to the federal wolves the very microsecond his own skin was in danger. "Julian, how could you?" Claire whispered, her voice breaking into a devastating, breathless sob that echoed across the quiet driveway. Julian didn't even look back at her. He kept walking toward the federal vehicle, muttering hurried excuses to the agents about cooperating for a lighter sentence. The federal prosecution moved swiftly and mercilessly through the courts. The high-definition digital recordings from the Midtown Manhattan Bank, the fraudulent medical affidavits signed by the bribed psychiatrist, and Julian's frantic attempts to execute the illegal credit line formed an airtight case that could not be beaten. Because he showed zero remorse, tried to blame his wife, and attempted to exploit the federal banking system for personal gain, the federal judge handed down a severe sentence. There was no probation, no plea bargain, and no early release window. Julian Sterling was sentenced to 5 solid years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. As for Claire, the federal investigation cleared her of direct criminal conspiracy after they reviewed her terrified hesitation and marginal involvement, but the emotional damage was absolute and permanent. Her husband was behind bars, serving 5 hard years for a crime fueled by his own bottomless greed, and the man she had sacrificed her relationship with her mother for had traded her freedom for a shot at a plea deal in less than 10 seconds. Sitting back in my studio, overlooking the quiet Hudson Valley estate, sipping my morning tea in absolute peace, I didn't feel anger anymore. I only felt the quiet closure of an old canvas finally restored. The traps were sprung, the predators were caged by their own hand, and the law had collected every single cent it was owed. In the end, betrayal always destroys the traitor first, leaving behind but the cold, quiet echo of justice. Time is the ultimate solvent. It washes away the cheap veneer of deceit, softens the jagged edges of betrayal, and leaves only what is structurally sound. Several months had passed since the federal marshals led Julian away in handcuffs and his 5-year prison term began. The legal storms had cleared, the bank fraud investigations were permanently closed, and my Hudson Valley estate had returned to its deep, quiet rhythm. Then came the rain. It was a late autumn afternoon when a cold, steady drizzle began to mist over the valley. I was inside my studio, delicately blending a fine coat of protective amber varnish onto a 17th century oil painting, when I noticed a solitary figure standing motionless outside my front security gates. It was Claire. She looked a lifetime older than the woman who had walked across my lawn holding a bakery box of pie just months prior. She stood alone in the downpour, without a luxury SUV, without a designer handbag, and without a protector. She wore a simple, soaked trench coat, carrying a single weathered canvas duffel bag containing whatever few belongings she could salvage after her divorce was finalized and she was forced to move into a cramped, rented studio apartment downtown, working 2 jobs just to cover her own rent and living expenses. The iron gates were unlocked. Marcus had long since released all the defensive administrative restrictions once the federal case concluded. But Claire didn't push them open. She simply sank slowly to her knees, right on the wet gravel, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she wept with a raw, shattered grief that cut straight through the steady sound of the rain. She wasn't crying for the wealth she had lost or the social status she had traded away. She was crying for the ruin of her own making, for the mother she had betrayed, and for the blind loyalty she had given to a man who sold her out the very second his own skin was in danger. I set down my restoration brush, walked slowly across the wide wooden floorboards of the studio, picked up a large black umbrella, and stepped out onto the porch. The cool autumn air carried the scent of wet pine and damp earth. I walked down the stone pathway, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the rain, and stopped right in front of the iron gate. Claire looked up, her face pale, streaked with tears and rain, her lips trembling as she stared up at me like a lost child. "Mom, please," Claire choked out, her voice breaking into a ragged, desperate sob. "I am so sorry. I was so blind, so stupid, and so arrogant. I ruined everything. Please, can you ever forgive me?" Her plea hung heavy and desolate in the dripping air. For months, internet commentators and radio listeners across the country had debated whether a mother could ever forgive a daughter who handed her over to a predator. But forgiveness is not a simple toggle switch. It is a long, delicate process of structural repair. I didn't throw my arms around her, and I didn't pretend that the past few months had never happened. I simply opened the heavy iron gate, stepped forward, and held the umbrella over her head to shield her from the chilling rain. "Forgiveness is a gift I give to my own soul, Claire," I said quietly, my voice calm, steady, and resolute against the patter of the raindrops. "It releases me from the weight of bitterness. But remember this. When you tear a canvas, applying solvent and patching the threads can save the painting from total destruction, but it will never restore it to the exact, untouched perfection of the fabric it was. You cannot untear the cloth. You have to pick up the brush, grind your own pigments, and paint a new life for yourself with your own hands." Claire stared at me, the words sinking deep into her soul, her tears mixing with the rain as she finally nodded, understanding the true weight of accountability. I didn't invite her back into the main house to live as my dependent. The umbilical cord of codependency was permanently severed. But as I turned around and walked back toward the warm, golden light of my restoration studio, I left the side gate open for her to find her own way toward shelter. Inside the studio, the amber lamps cast a soft, welcoming glow across the antique work tables. I walked back to my easel, picked up my fine-point sable brush, and gently touched the canvas. The restoration was complete.
The colors were rich, the foundational layers were unbreakable, and the surface was entirely free of false strokes or hidden flaws. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing clean the earth, while inside, the canvas stood enduring, silent, and whole.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.